Boston, autumn 2024. The late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows of my Beacon Hill apartment, painting the hardwood floors in shades of gold and orange. Outside, the street was quiet except for the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of traffic. Inside, I was setting the dining table with a precision I hadn't practiced in years. The good china, polished silverware, linen napkins folded neatly, it all had to look just right. For the first time since our divorce, I had invited Mary over for Thanksgiving dinner. My idea was simple. Bury the hatchet, share a meal, maybe remember that once upon a time we could be in the same room without looking for the nearest exit. The turkey was in the oven, the cranberry sauce chilling in the fridge. A bottle of Pinot Noir breathed on the counter, its rich scent filling the air every time I passed. As I adjusted a candle, I found myself rehearsing in my head what I might say to her. Keep it light. No talk about the past. Smile, ask about her job, maybe even compliment her. I wanted her to see that I'd moved on, that I wasn't the bitter man she'd left behind. In a way, it wasn't even about her. It was about me proving to myself that I could be gracious. Of course, our history was anything but neat. The end of our marriage had been messy, tangled up with a business betrayal that had left me not only single but nearly bankrupt. And while Mary wasn't the one who signed the papers that ruined me, she was standing on the sidelines holding hands with the man who did. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I took a breath, smoothed my shirt, and opened the door. Mary stood there in a tailored coat, smiling politely, and next to her was Eric. 50 years old now, but I would have recognized him anywhere. The same smug grin, the same confident stance. My stomach clenched, but my face didn't flinch. I stepped aside, gesturing them in, my voice calm even as my pulse spiked. "Alex," Eric said with a tone that landed somewhere between greeting and challenge. He extended his hand like we were old friends. I shook it, feeling the strength in his grip, and fought the urge to pull away too quickly. Mary's eyes darted between us, gauging the temperature of the room. We moved to the dining table, the smells of roasted turkey and herbs wrapping around us. I poured the wine, handed them glasses, and tried to maintain a host's smile. The first few minutes were filled with small talk, Boston weather, the holiday traffic, mutual acquaintances. But Eric carried himself as if this were his apartment, his table, his invitation. He leaned back in the chair, commenting on the decor with a casual authority that scraped against my nerves. Mary tried to keep the conversation flowing, but every attempt to lighten the mood seemed to give Eric another opening for a jab. "Remember that deal we almost closed back in the day?" he said, grinning. "Shame it didn't work out." The way he said it made the word shame sound like pathetic. I sipped my wine, letting the heat roll over my tongue before answering. "Yes," I said, my tone even. "I remember it clearly." And I did. I remembered the meetings, the contracts, the way I'd trusted him with the final negotiations, and the way he'd walked away with the deal, leaving me to clean up the mess. The toasts came awkwardly. Mary raised her glass to old friends and new beginnings, her smile brittle. We clinked glasses, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Eric smirked over the rim of his wine glass, his eyes locked on mine. There was no mistaking the look. It wasn't camaraderie, it was provocation. As the conversation wore on, the tension settled over the table like a heavy blanket. The food sat between us, steaming and untouched for long stretches as we danced around unspoken history. My original plan, a warm, civil evening, felt like a distant fantasy. I had imagined laughter, maybe even a hint of nostalgia. Instead, I found myself sitting across from the man who had dismantled both my marriage and my business, watching him enjoy the meal I had prepared. By the time dessert came out, I knew the truth. This wasn't a simple dinner, and it wasn't about reconciliation. Eric hadn't come to share in a holiday. He'd come with a purpose I hadn't figured out yet, but one that had nothing to do with peace. And as I cleared the plates, I realized the night was just getting started, and it would be nothing like I had planned. The turkey was carved, the plates filled, and the wine poured, but the air between us felt heavier than the meal itself. Eric sat back in his chair like a man presiding over his own banquet, his voice carrying just enough volume to make sure every word landed. He didn't just answer questions. He steered the conversation, peppering it with sly digs and smirking at his own jokes. "Alex, you've really stepped up your place here," he said at one point, glancing around the apartment. "Not bad, considering where things left off." The comment sounded like a compliment if you didn't know the history, but I did. Every word was a needle. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside I could feel the pressure building. The problem was, Eric had always been good at this, getting under my skin without giving me anything obvious to push back on. That skill had served him well years ago when we were still business partners and I still thought he was a friend. The memory came back uninvited. It was 2016, and we were on the verge of closing a major tech contract with a Boston-based medical software company. The deal was worth millions and would have put our small consulting firm on the map. I handled the technical side, Eric worked the negotiations. We'd been a strong team, or so I thought. Then one afternoon, I walked into a meeting room at the company's Back Bay office expecting to sign the final agreement. Instead, I found out the contract had already been signed, with Eric's new company. He'd quietly registered it 2 months earlier, funneled the client away, and left me holding a stack of worthless commitments and the debt from months of prep work. By the time the dust settled, my business was gone, my reputation dinged, and Eric had moved into a bigger house in the suburbs. Now he was here, sipping my wine and acting like none of that had happened. Mary, sitting between us, seemed to sense the tension but had no idea how to fix it. "Remember that summer we all went to Cape Cod?" she said suddenly, her voice too bright. "The clam chowder place?" She was trying to drag us into safe territory, but it only gave Eric another opening. "Oh yeah," he said, looking at me with mock warmth. "That was the year Alex forgot to confirm the rental and we had to improvise." He laughed, shaking his head like it was a harmless anecdote, but the tone made it clear he was enjoying himself. I felt the heat rise in my chest. I could have shut him down right then, told Mary exactly what kind of man she'd brought to my table, laid out the betrayal in front of both of them. The words hovered on my tongue. But I also knew that once they were out, there'd be no putting them back. Did I want to hand him the satisfaction of watching me lose my cool? Did I want Mary thinking this dinner had been some kind of setup for revenge? The silence between his barbs was almost worse than the comments themselves. I forced myself to take small bites, to sip water between them, to answer only when necessary. Mary kept filling the gaps with questions about my work, my neighbors, even my favorite new restaurant, but each attempt seemed to circle back to Eric. He'd jump in asking about current projects or new contacts, the questions framed casually but with just enough weight to make me notice. 2 small verbal clashes broke through my restraint. The first came when he made another offhand remark about how some people learn the hard way about who to trust. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Some lessons are worth learning once." The second was over the wine. He insisted the bottle I'd chosen wasn't the right pairing for turkey. I told him I'd take my chances. Both exchanges ended with him smirking and Mary pretending she hadn't noticed. It was becoming obvious that he wasn't here just for Thanksgiving. He had an angle. I didn't know yet if it was personal, professional, or both, but I could feel him circling around something. Then, in the middle of Mary telling a story about her office's holiday charity drive, I caught it, a quick glance from Eric toward the fireplace. Specifically, toward the low shelf where a dark leather folder rested. Inside were documents for a new contract I'd been working on, one that wasn't public knowledge yet. His eyes lingered for just a beat too long before sliding back to Mary, his expression smooth as if nothing had happened. That glance told me more than all his words combined. Whatever brought him here tonight, it wasn't the turkey or the holiday spirit. He was after something, and I had a feeling it was sitting just a few feet away from him. The morning light crept through the blinds, catching the edges of the fireplace mantel where I kept the folder. I noticed it immediately. The leather binder wasn't sitting flush with the edge of the shelf like I had left it. It was pushed back, angled slightly, as if someone had picked it up and returned it in a hurry. My stomach tightened. I hadn't touched it since Tuesday, and the only people in my apartment last night were Mary and Eric. I replayed the end of the evening in my head. After Mary excused herself, saying she had an early morning, Eric had lingered. "Just going to finish my wine," he'd said, settling into the armchair in the living room. I'd busied myself in the kitchen, stacking plates, rinsing glasses. From the clink of ice in his glass, I thought he was still in the chair. Now I wondered if he'd been on his feet, flipping through my work. The folder wasn't just paperwork. It was the foundation for a new contract I'd been developing for months, a software integration project for a medical research firm based in Cambridge. The deal was sensitive, not yet public, and worth more than anything I'd touched in years. If those details got out, competitors could underbid me in a heartbeat. And if Eric had even an ounce of the cunning I remembered, he'd see the potential and go straight for it. That afternoon, needing air and coffee, I stopped at the Whole Foods on Cambridge Street. I was in the produce section weighing apples when I heard that too familiar voice. "Alex," he said, strolling toward me with a basket in one hand. "What are the odds?" His grin was polished, the same as always. We traded pleasantries for a minute, the kind you exchange with someone you don't trust but can't outright ignore. Then, as he turned a lemon over in his palm, he dropped it. "You know, some business is better kept quiet until the right moment." Too many years in this town. He looked right at me when he said it, the faintest glint in his eyes. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't nothing. I smiled back just enough to hide the knot forming in my chest. If he thought he could spook me into showing my cards, he'd underestimated me. By the time I walked out of the store, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront him directly, and I wasn't going to sit back and wait for him to make the next move. If he wanted to play, we'd play. That evening, I texted him an invitation to come by my garage on Saturday. "Got something to run by you?" I wrote. He agreed within minutes. The garage wasn't just a place for my car. It was my workspace, tools hanging on the walls, a battered wooden workbench in the corner, and the kind of casual privacy you can't get in a coffee shop. When Eric arrived, I greeted him warmly, handing him a beer and gesturing toward the folding chairs I'd set out. We started with small talk, sports, the rising cost of property in Boston, even a quick laugh about traffic on the Pike. Then I eased the conversation toward business, tossing out just enough about a new opportunity without giving away specifics. He leaned in when I mentioned the size of the contract and the connections it could open. His questions were casual on the surface. "So, who's backing it? Got the financing lined up?" But they were pointed, like he was mapping the whole thing in his head. The longer we talked, the more I saw the outline of his intentions. He wasn't just curious. He was working an angle the same way he had years ago. He hinted at contacts in Boston's business scene, investors, legal teams, even a couple of decision-makers at companies that could smooth the process. But there was a catch. Every time he mentioned moving forward, it was in the plural. "We could lock this down fast," he said. "We could leverage Mary's connections at the foundation." He wasn't just trying to wedge himself into my deal, he was looking to pull Mary in too, using her nonprofit ties as another way in. By the end of the conversation, there was no doubt left. He hadn't come to my apartment for reconciliation or for turkey. The holiday was just a convenient excuse. He'd walked through my door with one goal, to get his hands on my work and ride it for all it was worth. As I watched him leave the garage, beer bottle still in hand, I realized the real game had just started, and this time I wasn't the one about to be blindsided. I called Eric the next day and told him I was open to talking about the deal. My voice was steady, almost casual, but I made sure to plant the line early. If we did anything, it had to be done clean. No backroom moves, no cutting corners, no under-the-table agreements. He chuckled in that dismissive way of his, the sound of a man who already assumes he'll run the table. "Of course, Alex," he said. Straightforward all the way. The words meant nothing coming from him, but I let them hang there like a handshake we both knew wasn't worth much. Mary was harder to read. She'd been avoiding direct questions about Eric since the holiday dinner, but I could tell she didn't like where this was going. When I mentioned the possibility of working with him, her face tightened just a bit, though she didn't object. Some part of her still clung to the idea that Eric could be trusted, or maybe she just didn't want to admit she'd been wrong about him for years. Either way, she was caught between us, knowing our history but not ready to choose a side. The next few days played out like a slow-motion chess match. We met twice in public spots around Boston, both times with the air of men discussing an ordinary business venture. Over coffee in a Back Bay cafe, I floated a story about a new investor from out of state who was willing to fund half the project. The details were thin and deliberately misleading, the kind of thing that could only be confirmed through the wrong channels. Eric leaned forward, interested, asking just enough to sound engaged without revealing how badly he wanted specifics. 2 days later, in a small corner booth of an old pub in South Boston, I mentioned a quiet supplier who could deliver hardware at half the market price. I named a bogus contact and gave him a phone number that led to a voicemail I controlled. His eyes lit up at the mention of margins, and I could almost hear the wheels turning. It was exactly the reaction I was fishing for. Mary came to one of these meetings, sitting silently while we traded pieces of information like two card players bluffing their way through a high-stakes hand. She broke in once to ask if we were sure about this partnership, but Eric waved her off with a smooth line about maximizing opportunity and making sure everyone wins. I caught the way she glanced at me afterward, a flicker of doubt in her expression, but she didn't press it. I knew Eric's next move before he made it. A man like him can't resist the chance to take the short route, especially if it means cutting someone else out. Sure enough, within 48 hours I got confirmation from a mutual contact that he'd been making calls. He'd taken my bait, chasing the fake investor and the non-existent supplier, trying to set up his own arrangement. He thought he was being clever, keeping me out of the loop until the pieces were in place. That was fine by me. I'd been preparing for this since the moment I saw his eyes linger on my folder by the fireplace. In my office, I assembled a polished project file. Same leather binder as the real one, same layout, but every figure inside was off by just enough to ruin any deal. The budgets were inflated, the timelines impossible, the key contacts, nothing more than friends who'd play along if called. It was a beautiful trap, neat and convincing, designed to collapse the moment anyone tried to use it. I made sure he'd have a chance to steal it without me having to hand it over directly. A casual meeting at my place, a drink in the living room, me stepping away for a phone call. When I came back, the binder was gone from the desk. Eric was still in his chair, wearing that faint smile he probably thought looked subtle. We wrapped up the evening with idle talk about the Bruins' chances this season, like nothing had changed. When he left, the binder was tucked under his arm, hidden beneath his coat. He walked down the front steps with the confident gait of a man convinced he'd just secured the winning card. I stood at the window watching him disappear into the street, calm as ever. Let him think he'd pulled one over on me. The real work was already done, and now it was just a matter of waiting for him to play his hand, and for the whole thing to blow up right in his face. 2 weeks later, the headlines hit like a cold wind off the harbor. Eric's name was plastered across the local business news, tied to a catastrophic breakdown in negotiations for a major tech contract. The article went into delicious detail, though I read it without smiling. It laid out how he had presented figures that didn't match reality, contacts that turned out to be dead ends, and budget projections so flawed they looked almost intentional. His partners had pulled out immediately, some of them publicly distancing themselves with carefully worded statements. The reporter even quoted an anonymous source calling the whole thing an amateur's disaster. I didn't need to read between the lines to know that was the binder talking. I didn't expect Mary to show up that night, but around 7 she knocked on my door. She came in without waiting for me to say anything, moving past me into the kitchen. She wasn't dressed for a social call, and her expression wasn't warm. She sat down at the table, folded her arms, and stared at me like she was still deciding whether to yell or listen. "Did you have anything to do with this?" she asked. The question was sharp, but her voice had a thread of something else. Maybe fatigue, maybe resignation. I poured us both coffee before I answered. "I didn't create the mess," I said finally. "I just didn't stop him from walking into it." She gave a short, humorless laugh and shook her head. "You set him up." I shook mine in return. "No. I just made sure the path he chose led exactly where it was always going to. He would have done the same thing to me, he already has." For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock over the sink. She traced a finger along the rim of her mug, her eyes fixed somewhere on the tabletop. "I guess I wanted to believe he could change," she said quietly. "I wanted to believe I didn't." She stopped there, but I knew the rest. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I've learned over the years that some truths don't land just because you say them. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said instead. But I wasn't going to let him do it again. Sometimes the best way to win is to let the other guy dig his own hole, then just stand back. I kept my tone even, no triumph in it, no gloating. I wasn't interested in rubbing it in. Watching him implode in the headlines was enough. I didn't need to parade my satisfaction. She nodded slowly, still not meeting my eyes, then finally looked up. There was a kind of reluctant understanding there, even if it wasn't forgiveness. She finished her coffee, thanked me without much emotion, and left. I didn't see her again after that night. Eric didn't come around either. Word was he'd left Boston for new opportunities, somewhere down south, though I suspected the truth was less optimistic. Men like him don't thrive without someone to lean on, and he'd burned too many bridges to find solid footing. As far as I was concerned, he could disappear entirely. The year turned over, the seasons shifted, and before I knew it, another Thanksgiving rolled around. I set the same table in my apartment, but this time the chairs were filled with people I trusted, 2 close friends from my sailing club, a couple from down the hall, and my business partner with his wife. The air was warm with the scent of turkey, laughter bounced off the walls, and the conversation never dipped into the kind of silence that comes when someone's looking for an opening to cut you down. As I poured wine for my guests, I thought about how different the room felt from the year before. No hidden agendas, no careful watching of every word, no wondering which fork in the road would lead to another disaster. Just food, stories, and the easy rhythm of people who were there for the right reasons. Holidays come in all shapes and sizes. The trick is knowing who you invite to your table. Sometimes one invitation can change the whole game.